Hello, everybody, and welcome to another lecture of English 120 Critical Writing. Today, because last week what we did was we went over, our research projects, and hopefully you're all starting to think about your topics and what your research question is going to be. What I'd like to talk about today is resources, right, and research. Because you can't have a research paper without doing the research. Now, what does that mean? So, whenever we are doing research, we are doing research from various perspectives, right? When we are researching, you know, say if we have a question about something, like I often find myself with many questions. I'll see something on Instagram and I'll just, not be sure if it's true. And I just do a quick Google, right? Now, that's fine in our day to day lives to do a quick Google just to get a glance at some cursory information. Maybe we read an article or two to help firmly establish what it is that we want to know. But when it comes to academic writing, or indeed writing for, say, if any of you are aspiring novelists, if you're writing, say, historical fiction, things like that, there are certain sources that are better than others. And that is just an unfortunate part of having such widespread access to information, right? We can find something, and I said this last week, so I apologize for repeating myself, but we can find something that says anything we need it to be, right? Many of you might be aware of the term, or have heard at the very least, confirmation bias, right? This idea that we look up certain things just to prove what it is that we think is correct, right? So, as I mentioned last week with the example of, say, vaccines, if you believe that vaccines cause autism, or vaccines are bad for us in some way, you can probably find a source that tells you just that. And that's, if that is what you are looking for, you can find it. That being said, when we are doing research for our research papers, we are checking different kinds of sources. So sorry about that. I was just putting my phone down. If any of you heard a slight scuffle noise. So when we are doing research for a research paper, a lot of times what we have to look at is certain kinds of sources, right? You might have heard the phrase peer-reviewed bandied about in your time at the university level, but really what peer-reviewed as a resource really means is it just means this is a source that has been checked by peers of the writer, right? It's a, as much as it seems like a very pretentious term, it's actually, kind of practical, I suppose. Now, that is not to say it is flawless. There are many such results that have been found that were peer reviewed and have been, it turns out, complete bunk, right? Now, but that is by and large an anomaly and not a fact, or not that it's not a fact, but that is more of an anomaly than a rule, right? The whole idea of the peer review is not that it is a flawless form of conducting research or publishing, but rather that the peer review just means that it has gone through a process of being checked and or double checked, right? So, when we are looking for sources, sometimes you can search for a peer-reviewed source. When you are searching for a scholarly source, you might look for something. I actually have a couple things over here. So, for example, if you're looking for a scholarly source, this is, I just got it, so hence why it's wrapped in plastic. This is from Cornell, their East Asia series. They have a rather good East Asian literature department. And so, for example, this is published by Cornell. Cornell is a rather notable, if not prestigious, university. And I bought this book about, you know, early Heian Japanese poetry. And that is considered a scholarly source, right? Is a source that is produced or published by a university. So, using these terms like peer reviewed or scholarly source, there is a point to them. It's not just something that is, and sometimes whenever words are kind of thrown about so frequently, they can often seem hollow. And granted, there's sonic satiation, like the idea that if you say a word enough, it just loses all meaning and just becomes a sound. Um, but really, what it comes down to is when we want to perform research for an academic paper, we want to make sure that the research has undergone some level of scrutiny, right? Now, that's not to say that you can't use an article from Democracy Now! Or The Guardian or something like that. You absolutely may, especially if you're dealing with a topic that is often discussed in current events, right? So that's not to say that you can only use scholarly or peer reviewed or whatnot, right? So keep that in mind, right? But it's about striking a balance, right? MLA, for all of its faults, MLA being the form that we use when we cite our work, and we've talked about citation a bit in this class, and we've talked about what to cite, right? We cite quotes and we cite paraphrases. But MLA, so the form of citation, for some of its problems, one of the things that I love about MLA is that you can kind of cite anything. You can cite a tweet or an X, I guess. Is that what it is now? An X? So you can cite a tweet, you can cite a YouTube video, you can cite something on Netflix, you can cite a professor's lecture, you can cite basically you name it, you can cite it. Now, that is a great way of, essentially that is a great way of treating all knowledge as having similar value, right? Because the whole thing, like I was saying, with scholarly research, like scholarly sources or peer reviewed, that is not without its problem. Especially when you consider like the academy, and by the academy I mean higher education, the university system, that has its problems, right? And so if you look at things like, say, systemic racism, right, the difficulty or almost inability for black scholars and black women scholars to get published, right? Suddenly we should start to question, like, oh, this whole idea of like scholarly sources, right? So again, it's about a balance. I'm not saying go all in on peer reviewed or scholarly research, but I'm also not saying go all in on otherwise. But we do need to have some sort of equivocation of knowledge in a sense, I guess, right? But either which way, right? Whether we're citing a blog, whether we're citing someone's social media, there are all sorts of ways in which we can treat various forms of media, of speech, of knowledge, in a rather democratic light. Now, when we are looking at our source, whether it is scholarly or not scholarly, there are many things that we should do, right, when it comes to evaluating our sources. And that is the main topic today, is evaluating our sources. And so that's why I brought out my phone before, and you saw me gesturing with my phone in hand, is I have, and I cannot claim ownership of this. This was shown to me by a librarian. What is called the CRAAP test. CRAAP with two A's, of course, because no acronym is perfect. So what the CRAAP test is, and I will post these notes on our classes page, right? But what the CRAAP test is it is a test where we can evaluate our sources. It's not about eliminating a source. It's about evaluating it. Is it a good source? Is it a not so good source? Is it a source whose weaknesses are known to you? And if not, this test will help you understand what the weaknesses and strengths of your source will be. So, going in acronym order, our C is currency. Now, so currency, when we think of that word, we typically think of money, but how current is this source? That's really what this is asking, is how timely is this information? Now, for the humanities, depending on the field that you're in, right? Anything within the last, say, 60 to 60-ish years is considered current, right? So you have scholars that still will use, go back even further and they still use Marx or Freud, say, right? You have people who use even more contemporaries, or not contemporaries, more contemporary sources who might be like, if not Freud, Lacan, and Lacan was in the writing in the 50s and onwards. So, it's, for the humanities, current is a bit of an iffy thing. Or not iffy, but it's just, it is a bit more of an expiration date than in the sciences. Now, in the sciences, you want the most current data, right? That is incredibly important, unless you're taking a more historical look at the sciences. But by and large, with sciences, you always want to figure out, like, if you are, say, I'll use a topic one of my nursing students did. She was looking into the connection between, I can't remember the medical terms, but essentially dementia or some sort of deteriorating mental alacrity and getting Botox, right? Fascinating. And believe it or not, there is a connection, or at least according to her research. But it's really, really important to find the most up-to-date information. And the same goes in the humanities. You want to use current information because there's several things you don't want to do. You don't want to do use research that somebody already found a problem with, right? Or somebody already, pointed out the issues of this source or this research. And you also don't want to say something that somebody else has already said, right? And that's not even accusing you of plagiarism or anything like that. It's just someone might find it unoriginal. And just even like, no sense repeating, right? So some questions that you can ask with whether or not your source is current, like, so how timely is this information? Is this information current or out of date? Is there anything more recent? And how does the currency of the information affect your topic, right? So how does the newness or currency, as I mentioned, how does that impact what it is that you're saying, right? If this is new information that's come to light, well, surely other people are speculating on this too, or if this is older information and if there has not been an update, that could be something that you argue for, right? Is that we need to kind of update this information because it's frankly out of date, right? My student who found whose research kind of pointed toward this connection between dementia and Botox and receiving Botox, the main thing that she was arguing for was just that we need to study it more. Because there wasn't that much information and there needed to be more information. And again, in the sciences, the whole idea of repeating or having repeatable labs or processes, that's so essential. So you can have a couple of people talking about something and maybe they found compelling research or they have compelling research, but it might be something that needs to be studied more, right? So that's our C, or C. I gotta work on flipping this. R is relevance. So does this information fit our needs, right? So for example, if we were writing a paper, say, on social media and how it affects adolescents. Now, adolescence, depending on where you get your definition of adolescent from, it could be anything from about 12 to 19, give or take a couple years, depending on the definition. Now, if you are looking at, say, how, this is a topic that's been kind of done to death, but say, okay, I want to look at how social media shapes the mental development and self-esteem of adolescents, right? It's pretty specific. It's okay. It's not my best work. But if we're looking at that and we find something that's talking about how social media affects children, right? So 11 and under, it's not really relevant to us. It might come up in our search because it's going to come up with social media and maybe even mental development, but it doesn't fit our needs. And we can try to make it fit, but it's going to feel like a stretch. Now, sometimes what you can argue is this idea that we should be applying this to a different range, or we can say the findings of this study where they studied the mental development effects of social media on children, and maybe what we could argue is that because there's similar mental development stages when they're adolescents, that perhaps it still applies, but you would have to make that argument. You have to say what it is, right? You can't just be like, what do you think? That's not what we do when we're writing. We need to, in our own way, say what it is that we're thinking because we are trying to persuade our reader. We don't necessarily want our reader, to just be handed our information and be like, hey, you come up with your own conclusions, because that they could just Google search it. That's not what this is. It's that you are the author. You are the writer of this. And us as writers, we are communicating our ideas and we are trying to be persuasive while doing so. So it's, it's, as much as people say oh, I don't like to be spoon-fed and all that such, that's not what's happening here. We're not spoon-feeding people, and we're not telling them necessarily we're not forcing an opinion on them, but we are giving them an opinion, and we're basically saying hey, here's all the information, here's the conclusion you can come to, and that is up to you. But that's why we are persuasive, because the whole point is being educated and receiving an education is in some form persuasion. That is not free of bias, right? Excuse me. So Relevance. So does the information fit our needs? Does it relate to our topic? And I kind of discussed that. Is the information at an appropriate level? Now that one's, I feel like one that I want to kind of dig into a little bit. When I ask, like, is it at an appropriate level? What I mean by that is it too simple, too complex, or just right? Like that right combination of both, or either, or neither. But the idea being is that, are you using information that is going to just fly over your reader's head, right? Because we need to have a target audience. Or is the information possibly too simple to the point where, like, is there a need to even say anything, right? So, for those in the sciences, this can be a special challenge, but also for those in the humanities, right? So for somebody like me, where some of my studies is in the field of gender, right? And so there are certain writers who are super accessible, and I love them for that. And what I mean by accessible is that they're using really accessible language, and it's something that I can easily kind of quote them and interpret them, and not feel like I have to do so much work on the interpreting front. And then there are others, and their language is so technical and so like difficult, and it's not approachable. And some might argue that new ideas and new thoughts require new language, but I am of the school of thought where it's like we should make our writing accessible to people. So that's something that you have to consider, is if you're using something that is so deeply technical, like, are you going to spend a lot of your paper trying to explain it? And if that's the case, maybe that's not the best source to use sometimes. Or perhaps what you can do is just give a brief summary. But the whole idea of technicality, or the technical side of this, is like, is this something that is going to be approachable for your readers? Is this going to be accessible for your readers? And this isn't to say, again, not to use it, but it's about knowing the difficulty. It's about knowing, like, oh, is this uses a lot of lingo and jargon, right? So jargon is like field specific language. Like, if you're not in this field, you'll likely not know these terms. So these are questions that we have to ask, because depending on our answer depends on how we present this to the readers, right? So if I'm using Judith Butler, and I love Judith Butler, but their writing is very dense. Love them. Dense writing. Very, very, depending on what you're reading, very difficult to decode. And so sometimes in using their writing, I have to have an understanding of that, and an understanding of my audience as well, because I want to be able to communicate these ideas to my readers. And knowing that level of simplicity or complication changes that. And again, the CRAAP test is not about getting rid of sources. The CRAAP test is about evaluating them. So evaluations like, should I keep this source or not? Hopefully that's happening already, like when you're doing your searches. But if not, yeah, that'll happen here. But also, for even a source that is considered like a really good source, you still got to ask questions of it. You still have to evaluate it. And that's such a necessary part of research, because that's, we're taking notes on our own research, because we have to figure out how to communicate this to our reader, and how do we connect this to our topic, right? Because our research, sometimes the research and the topic aren't always going to meet, right? So one of the things that I've written about previously is taking, monsters or like the monstrous and things like that, and also combining that with gender theory and theories of gender. So and it's about like, taking those two and finding a way to connect, right? Because I have theories that I'm trying to sort of impress upon my reader, and maybe I'm using some really complicated sources. It's so necessary for me to be able to make those connections so that I can show the reader the connections that these seemingly uh, different works have, right? So that's relevance. So that's our R. Now we have our A, our first A. Keep in mind, because there's two A's in this crap. Authority. Who wrote it? And we've talked about this before with ethos. We've talked about this before when talking about appealing to authority and whatnot. But who wrote it is a great fucking question, right? So much of what asking who wrote it isn't just like, well, it's Carl. We all know Carl. No, that's not what we mean by who wrote it. It's basically asking like, who is the author? Who's the publisher or the source? Like I showed you the book over here that was published by Cornell. Cornell has a pretty good record of publication. All right, but is there something that I need to think about in terms of the author or the translator's credentials, right? So the whole idea, there's these questions that we should ask, like, is this a reputable source, right? So is story time. A great example of this is there was an article, and I used to know who it was published by. I think it was the Wall Street Journal. It might be The Economist or something like that. But it was an article that was published talking about how the lockdown during COVID did not save any lives, right? It was, we might as well have not locked down at all because there was no difference. Now, besides the fact that that's a complete logical fallacy and there's just no way to calculate that, the people who wrote it, now you might be thinking to yourself, well, professor, surely they were like microbiologists, right? Or surely they must be virologists. Or surely they must be like infectious disease specialists. Or surely they were economists, right? And their main concern was the harm that was done to the economy instead of the harm that was done to people. Now, that's incredibly important to note, right? Because, for example, like, I don't go to a podiatrist to get my heart checked. We have our specialties for a reason, right? As much as like I am getting my PhD and will be a doctor, I know that I'm not the one they ask for if they say, is there a doctor on the plane? I mean, unless somebody has a difficult, haiku that they're looking to figure out, which I doubt they'd make an announcement for that, but who knows? But, so this idea of who the author is really important. What are their credentials? What's their reputation, right? Sometimes it's worth even just like, this might sound like weird or kind of stalkery, but sometimes it's worth going on the author's social media page. That's really huge for me, is that if ever I see an article, I'm like, this seems sus, I'll go on their social media. You can figure out a person's views pretty quick when you jump on their socials. And really the idea is that, this is just, we want to figure out what is in this person's background that gives them the authority or experience to talk about this. Which is fair, I think, because we want to hear like, oh, we're going to be talking about the environment with somebody who's like, say, a climate scientist or, a biologist or something, something where it's like we get the connection. And we're not going to be like, oh yeah, I heard this from Steve on the bus. Steve. suddenly it just is, it's like, oh, I don't know about that information there. So, um, another thing to figure out is, does anybody else cite their work? Now, one of the beautiful things, I think it's Google Scholar that does this, but correct me if I am wrong. When looking up certain sources, I believe on, I think it's Google Scholar, but I have this like image in my head that it is Google Scholar. But there are certain sites where they let you know who else cited this work. Are a lot of people citing this work? And it's not to say that, oh, if a lot of people are citing this work, it must be correct. No, no, no. But who else is citing this work? How many people are citing this work? If this work is dying in obscurity, there has to be a reason why, right? And that's kind of what we would want to figure out. And maybe, who knows? Maybe this work has the secret to the universe, and nobody else has read it. Who knows? But if other people aren't citing it, there might be a reason why. If people are citing it to disagree with it, that's also something to take note of, right? So that's authority. Now we have our second A. We're almost finished with this crap. A is, sorry, I'm going to make a lot of jokes like that. And, well, actually, I'm not really sorry. It's really just a disclaimer. So the second A is accuracy. Now you can put either A in either order. This is just the order I put it in. Is accuracy. Is it true? Which is a fabulous question to ask, right? Is it true? So where did this person get the facts, right? Because it's always important to check what sources this person is citing. If they're suddenly not citing sources, but they're making some really big claims, might not be true. Just saying. Is it supported by evidence, right? But so like I said, if this person's making claims and they have zero evidence, it'd be a little sus. And do any other sources agree? Now, this is also kind of problematic, because there are sources that might agree with it that also share the same bias, and we're going to talk about bias in a little sec, in just a sec. That's part of our P, the letter, and so these are all things to think about when we're thinking about the accuracy of our sources. Is how accurate is it, right? Now, I saw an interview, or really a clip of an interview, because does anybody watch a full interview anymore? But I saw a clip where RFK Jr. Was talking in an interview about mercury in vaccines, right? And that kind of thing. And he was talking about, and he referred to this study, right? And the study's a real study. And like, it was a legit study. But the thing is that he misquoted the study. And he quoted the wrong information. Now, frankly, that can just be a simple mistake. But the thing is that if people then go and quote RFK Jr., who, as like the head of, what is it, Health and Human something, HHS, right? Anyways, so if people go and then quote him from this interview, well, then we got a problem, right? And like I said, I'm given benefit of the doubt. He can just be misremembering this study. The problem is that he used the study incorrectly to make the wrong conclusion, because the study found obviously different data than what he was alleging. So that's a problem, right? So again, these are things. So like, whenever you have an author that's using a study, now typically in a paper, it's not, you can't really say, oh, well, they might have misremembered, because a lot of times we're looking at the source when we're writing. That's the hope. Unless we're paraphrasing, it's always good to kind of put that up to the side. And we've talked about that before. Sorry, I don't know if anybody hears that, but my dog is asleep at my feet, and he's snoring very loudly. So if anybody hears that, it is adorable. And if you don't hear it, frankly, you're missing out. Um, so just accuracy. Is it right? Is it, is it true? Do other people agree with it in a way where it's like substantiated and not just people, circularly citing the work? And I'll post a video about circular citations as well, because not saying you have nothing else better to do. And lastly, our P. Now, the P can be whatever works for you in terms of remembering, but the P can be purpose, or the P can be point of view. The P could also be perspective too. Any of them really work, because it's all kind of saying the same thing. But the whole idea is like, what's the point of this resource? What's the purpose? Right? What is the perspective of the author? Now, are they trying to sell something? Are they trying to persuade you? Are they trying to voice an opinion, report on facts? Is there a bias, whether political, religious, cultural, or personal? And again, this is about evaluating a source, right? This is not about saying like, oh yeah, I need you to figure out your source is trash. That's not what this is about. This is about for the great sources, for the not so great sources. This is about evaluating them and recognizing these things about our sources, right? So everyone has a bias. I've I can show you an email thread. I was arguing with an editor-in-chief of this one online journal that I was writing for, because he always said my work had too much bias in it. And I was literally like, the bias is unavoidable. Everyone is biased. Every source is biased. And it's just about how much bias we have, right? It's impossible to remove it completely, because there are just going to be words that we use that will give a sense of bias. And sometimes when people try to be unbiased, they unfortunately use language that can diminish the events, right? So like, if people are, say, shot, there's a difference between saying that people were killed or people died, or even that people were murdered, right? All three words kind of have the same sort of ending, like a life ends, but they all have very different sort of implications, right? So that's something that we should consider when we look at a source. Like, what is the language here supporting, right? And I say that because bias is inevitable, and if we are aware of the bias, then we can work with the bias. That's all it is. It's not saying like, oh, get rid of your source for having a bias. However, there are some sources where they are biased to the point of being a bad source just because they're disputing fact, right? That's something that is like, what am I going to do with you? And that's maybe a source that you don't use, because you can easily use it if you wanted to, say, disagree with the source, but it's a bit of a softball, isn't it? It's a bit of a just really teeing. It's a bit of a softball. I'm not great with sports metaphors. Is that it's easy? Is what I'm trying to say. It's like I don't know, bowling with a 10-foot wide ball. I don't know, something sporty. Just my athletes chime in. But yeah, it's like some arguments you don't need to make, right? And I say that because sometimes I see people stitching on doing a stitch on Instagram, and I'm kind of like, this argument is so easy to make, and the person that you're stitching has like 2 followers, and one of them is probably related to them. Like, why give this person the platform? So that's kind of where I'm at. Like, sometimes there are certain arguments where it's like, why give this person the attention, you know? Um, so yeah, just thinking, just thoughts out loud. But that's our CRAAP test, all right? And that's really what I want us to do. Is I want us to, and frankly, don't just do this with don't just do this with like our research and our sources. You can use this, in your everyday life. If you're looking up a news item, yeah, absolutely. What's the harm in evaluating your news source? If you see an article and you're like, this seems sus, right? Like my parents sent me an article and they were like, oh yeah, this is happening. I'm not gonna say what it actually was. I'm not gonna try to start fights. And they were like, oh, this is happening, and I looked at it and I read something different than what they were claiming, and I was like, well, I don't know about that. And this isn't to say like, oh, outsmart everybody else. No, not at all. There is such a thing as tact, right? The being right is useless if no one listens to you. Then all you get is smug superiority. It's just you just sitting on your own, sitting on your couch by yourself, just being like, well, I was right. So, yeah, sometimes I feel like that. You ever see a horror movie and it's like the the cast is like they're teenagers and they're going into this woods and there's this old man and the old man's like, don't go into those woods, there's like this monster, and they're like, whatever, old man, and they go in anyway and they're all like killed. Sometimes I feel like the old man, and I'm like, don't do this. And but being right in these situations, there's that's why we look at being persuasive. And that's why we look at having things like tact, right? Where we try to be diplomatic with what we are saying. So, all things to consider. But the whole idea is that, when we are searching, we are using reputable searches. So, Google Scholar, as I mentioned before, JSTOR is another one. Project Muse is another one. Pace University has, for those watching who are my Pace students, Pace University has different relationships with these various sites, whether it's EBSCOhost or anything like that. But go on to Pace Libraries or check out your local library. Those of us who are in New York, we have the New York Public Library, which if you are a New York State resident, you don't have to be a resident of New York City or anything like that. You can get a New York Public Library card, right? I have mine. So and having the library card also means that you have benefits online and not just at the library. So these are all sources for you to use. These are all places where you can find your sources, and absolutely talk to your libraries, your university librarian, because they would love to help you. They would love to help you with your research. Okay? So, while all of you are working on your topic and submitting that, I want you to start doing, and I'll put this in the assignment, start compiling your sources. Okay? And, yeah. Hope everyone is doing amazing and just stay fabulous.